Thank you, Rusty. How you feeling?
All right. Okay, let's go to Psalm 119. I got the volume turned up a little bit. We'll just keep it there because my voice is so quiet. I don't know why. But also, if you'll keep my son-in-law Bruce in mind, he went ahead and started looking for another job in some form of youth ranch type stuff, So he's be praying for him and that venture. He wants to do that. Okay, we'll be in Psalm 119, and tonight we'll look at another letter, or the 14th letter, which is Nun, N-U-N. So that's when we'll be. It's the 14th set of 8s that we're covering. We'll do 22, and we'll break out in the spring, just about the time the potatoes come up. So anyway, this has to do with God's faithfulness or our response to God. And this is where we see more and more of the character of David and why he was called a man after God's own heart, because he was after God's heart. And so one of the greatest attributes of God, I don't know how to list them in order of importance, but is that God is faithful. And then he calls us to be faithful, doesn't he? God calls us to be faithful. So we talk a lot about faith and faithfulness. How would you describe faithful? What kind of words, synonyms would you use would fit in with being faithful? Loyal, yeah. Marine, Jimmy, yeah. All right, that's right. True. You say vows when you get married that express, we're going to build this on loyalty and faithfulness. And so there's always obedience to that, isn't there? You can't have faithfulness without obedience, can you? We can't be movable in our ways, or we can't really be considered faithful. And we want to be faithful. And like Rusty prayed, we need to pray for things that we need help with, and that would be one of them, that we would remain faithful. And it's one of the easiest things to lose sight of is God's faithfulness, and that's when we have a tendency to drift. If we don't believe or doubt God's faithfulness, then we have a tendency to act independently of God, don't we? Right? Is it hard to wait on God? And does Satan want to come in there and make us doubt God's faithfulness? Especially when something may be long and drawn out and whatever. So it's a real important subject that we're talking about tonight. Now, to backtrack a little bit, Rusty, thank you for covering last week. It was very good. I watched it. But last week, where were we? The week before would be, it was Mem, and I forgot how it was pronounced. But we saw such a radical change in the way David was talking. I mean, some days or weeks, it seems like we're really on top of this God thing and faith in God. I mean, it's like, it's great. And then David had just gotten through such a time, we call it before that his 11th hour psalm, where, and I don't know how much these are spaced apart, these letters and words are spaced apart in the time of his life. But he was actually counting the days, saying, Lord, how much longer am I going to live? It was bearing down on him so hard, he was counting the days. And so we saw, though, there's something very consistent about David, is that he's very consistent in his faith and obedience to God. I mean, talk about someone staying the course. There may not be anybody like him. Could put Daniel in that category. Could put Moses. or maybe Noah, those three. But David would certainly be up there with one of the most faithful men in the Bible. Now, he always, while going through his trials, always recommitted himself to the keeping of God's laws or statutes or word, whatever. He didn't use that as an excuse to bail out. Okay, I'm going to bail out because things are too hard. And our flesh will try to get us to do that, won't it? Okay, it's too hard, so therefore I have an excuse. I'm going to do such and such. But he wasn't that kind of guy. So look at verse 83, and you can start picking up that this guy, even though verse 83, I'm become like a bottle in smoke, yet do I not forget thy statutes. So there's one thing that he held on to, wasn't it? And so he kept on hoping, trusting, obeying until God brought him to a much higher plane. And that's when we talked about in the 13th letter, Mem, that he did some godly boasting. And that was that he said that he was wiser than his enemies. That's good, isn't it? He had more understanding than all his teachers, and he had more understanding than the ancients. And so we talked about that. And it was God doing that, he said, through your commandments. Through thy precepts I get understanding is what he ended that last one with. And that last one, Mem, was the picture of the spring or water. It was drawn with like the waves of a water. And so we talked about the woman at the well, and when she talked to Jesus and finally got down to the nitty-gritty of her confession and her need, then Jesus said, I would give you living water, and it would be a well of water springing up into everlasting life. And she asked him. And I'm sure he gave it to her. Under the Torah, David is experiencing this same thing, that well of water, that spiritual life that is coming up, even in the Old Testament, as people like David, not like the Pharisees who treated it as something just to memorize and to know for whatever advantage that might bring. David sought God through the Word. And there was a different sort of relationship that David had than the Pharisees. So this is David in the last refrain, the life-giving Spirit of God coming through David and him rejoicing in God's law and his hatred for every evil way. All right, so that was the last statement. I hate every false way, every lying way. So we see that his long period of extreme, whatever it was, trial had paid off. There was more purity in his faith, more dross taken away, and we ended with a statement, I think, every act of obedience strengthens the soul, and the reverse is true. Disobedience weakens it. All right. So, was David's faith and obedience tried? And is our faith being tried and called a process that is much more precious than the trying of gold to bring it forth and purify it? The gold yes. The Bible says it's much more precious than that process of bringing gold out of ore. So that's what David is going through. And what it accomplishes in us. So David then found what he called number one, and that was understanding and wisdom. That was the principal thing. The veil was removed off of him, and he got understanding and wisdom. And he tells Solomon that is the principal thing in life, right? And I don't know if we read that. That was in Proverbs chapter 2 and Proverbs chapter 8. So now, as we come to the 14th letter, Nun, it's pronounced noon, like high noon. It has a numerical value of 50. It's the third of the double letters. And it's said to represent faithfulness and the reward for faithfulness. And the pictograph, if you'll notice the position, it's one who is bent. I really couldn't do that as good as I wanted to, but it's the idea of one who bends in humility before God is crowned or rewarded. And that's the idea. So the one who is humble before God will stand upright in the final day. The one who is humble before God. And James talks a lot about humility. And what does he? He says, humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will do what? All right, he will exalt you, he will lift you up. That's exactly right. So humility at first is very difficult when you mix it with obedience, but then it gets better. Where disobedience is easier at first, but then it becomes much more difficult. And so the first use of none, as you probably have already thought of, is in Exodus 33, verse 11. All right? Joshua was the son of Nun. All right? And that's the Old Testament name for Jesus. And Joshua was the one who, after Moses could lead them up to see the land, or to see their need, you could say, maybe. The law can only show you your problem or your need. It can't fix it. And so Joshua leads them into the promised land. Faithful Joshua.